Somewhere beneath the polished floors and bureaucratic shuffle of the Ministry of Magic, there exists a darkness so carefully curated, so meticulously maintained, that most witches and wizards spend their entire careers pretending it doesn't exist at all. You stand now at the entrance to Level 13, which officially does not appear on any elevator panel, any architectural blueprint, or any internal memorandum, though you notice the maintenance budget for this non-existent floor somehow exceeds that of 3 legitimate departments combined, because even imaginary places require very real cleaning supplies. The wizard who escorts you wears no name badge, carries no wand visibly, and speaks in the kind of measured whisper that suggests he has seen things that permanently recalibrated his definition of dangerous, which honestly seems like a reasonable response to guarding objects that could theoretically unmake continents. Much like the ancient Library of Alexandria, which scholars estimate held between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls before its destruction in a fire that historians still debate was accidental or deliberate. An open scholarly controversy that remains unresolved to this day. These vaults contain knowledge that some argue should have been destroyed rather than preserved. You descend a spiral staircase carved from stone, so old it predates the ministry itself, each step worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps. And your guide mentions casually that the last person who ran down these stairs in a hurry is still being extracted from the third dimension, a process that should conclude sometime around next February if the paperwork gets approved. The air grows colder as you spiral downward, carrying the scent of iron, old parchment, and something else you cannot quite identify, but which makes the hair on your arms stand at attention like soldiers awaiting inspection. Curiously, medieval grimoires often referenced similar underground repositories where dangerous artifacts were kept, and one 15th century alchemist claimed to have visited a cellar beneath the world's floor that contained objects too wicked for destruction, though his account was largely dismissed because he also claimed to have invented a cheese that granted invisibility. You reach the bottom of the stairs where an enormous iron door stands sealed with 17 different locks, each requiring a different key held by a different guardian who lives in a different country and has never met any of the others, which seems like overkill, until you remember what waits on the other side, and then it suddenly seems rather optimistic. The door opens with a sound like a mountain exhaling after holding its breath for centuries, and you step into the first chamber of the ministry's most classified repository, where the walls themselves seem to lean inward with curiosity about who would be foolish enough to visit at this hour. Your guide gestures toward rows upon rows of illuminated cases, each containing an object that glows or pulses or occasionally screams softly in languages that predate human speech. And you realize with growing unease that you have willingly walked into what might generously be described as a museum of apocalypse prevention. The first exhibit that catches your attention sits suspended in a sphere of golden amber, a compass that appears to be pointing in 17 different directions simultaneously, its needle fractured into splinters that each insist upon their own truth with the stubborn confidence of someone who has never once consulted a map. Much as the Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799 during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, provided the key to understanding hieroglyphics by presenting the same text in 3 different scripts, this compass allegedly reads the layered geography of existence itself, pointing toward destinations and realities that overlap our own like pages in a book. Scholars continue to debate whether such parallel dimensions represent genuine alternate realities or merely mathematical abstractions, a controversy that grows more heated every decade as theoretical physics keeps accidentally agreeing with ancient mysticism. You lean closer to examine the amber prison, and your guide clears his throat nervously, mentioning that the last person who touched the glass spent 3 weeks convinced she was a small village in Wales, which made filing her incident report rather complicated since villages historically lack the fine motor skills required for signature. There exists a peculiar historical footnote suggesting that Pope Sylvester II possessed a mechanical head that could answer yes or no questions about the future. And you wonder briefly if it shares any heritage with this impossible navigation device that seems to know where everywhere is, including the everywheres that technically shouldn't exist. The compass case stands at the center of a circular room that your guide calls the Atrium of Intentions, though you suspect someone in the naming department was working through some personal issues when they chose that title, because the architecture here suggests less welcoming vestibule and more carefully orchestrated nightmare with excellent lighting. You move past the amber-encased compass and approach a section of the vault dedicated to what the Ministry classifies as temporal hazards, which is apparently bureaucratic language for objects that treat the space-time continuum like a suggestion rather than a law. And honestly, the casual way your guide discusses potential timeline collapse makes you wonder about the psychological screening process for this job. The first object in this section sits beneath a dome of glass that ripples like water despite being completely solid, and inside you see what appears to be an ordinary hand mirror with a silver frame tarnished by centuries of careful neglect, its surface reflecting nothing at all. Not the glass above it, not the lights around it, not your face when you peer closely, just an endless depth of silver that seems to breathe with slow anticipation. Your guide explains that this is the mirror of perspective consumption, created in the 13th century by a Venetian glassmaker, who was either a profound genius or profoundly unwell, possibly both, since historical records describe him as someone who conversed with his own elderly reflection decades before age had touched him, which sounds like either a miracle or the setup for a tragedy, and spoiler alert, it was definitely the second one. Much like the historical development of perspective in Renaissance art, which emerged in 15th century Florence and fundamentally changed how humans represented three-dimensional space on flat surfaces, this mirror represents a breakthrough in magical perception that scholars still struggle to fully understand, though in this case the breakthrough involved perceiving futures and then apparently eating them like temporal snacks. The mirror functions, your guide continues in his measured whisper, by showing viewers their possible futures across dozens of potential timelines, which sounds wonderful until he adds that the mirror then selects the futures it finds most appealing and absorbs them completely, removing those possibilities from existence with all the casual cruelty of someone crossing items off a grocery list because they decided they didn't really need happiness after all. You ask what happens to people who look into it, and your guide's pause stretches long enough that you regret the question, before he explains that most viewers report feeling diminished afterward, not in size or weight, but in potential, as though the number of possible versions of themselves suddenly contracted like a muscle refusing to relax, leaving them with fewer paths forward and the unsettling certainty that some of those missing paths were the good ones. The mainstream historical record includes numerous accounts of prophetic mirrors, most famously the obsidian scrying mirrors used by the Aztec civilization, and later acquired by the Elizabethan occultist John Dee, who claimed his shoe stone allowed angels to dictate entire mystical languages to him. And while scholars debate whether Dee was genuinely communicating with supernatural entities, or simply experiencing vivid hallucinations supplemented by an excellent imagination, nobody questions that his mirror currently sits in the British Museum, looking remarkably ordinary for something that allegedly served as heaven's telephone. The mirror of perspective consumption, however, makes Dee's artifact look about as threatening as a decorative hand mirror you might find at your grandmother's house. Assuming your grandmother never consumed your potential career as a famous musician, which you cannot entirely rule out because you did notice you became significantly less interested in guitar after that visit when you were 12. Your guide mentions that the mirror has been housed here since 1847, when a ministry confiscation team retrieved it from the estate of a collector who had looked into it every morning for 40 years and who was found in his parlor, surrounded by 17 versions of his own obituary, each describing a different death he could have had if the mirror hadn't eaten the timelines where he might have found meaning, purpose, or at the very least, the good sense to cover the cursed reflection with a bedsheet. The question of whether the mirror destroys futures or merely redirects them elsewhere remains an open scholarly debate, with some researchers arguing that consumed possibilities are annihilated completely, while others insist they must be stored somewhere, perhaps in the mirror's own internal dimension, perhaps in the silver depths that show nothing but seem to contain everything, and you find yourself hoping very strongly that the second theory is correct, because the alternative suggests that happiness itself can be permanently deleted by antique furniture. There exists a fringe historical account from a 17th century witch trial in Bavaria, where an accused woman claimed her mirror stole the babies from the village women, which prosecutors interpreted as confession to supernatural infanticide, but which some modern magical historians suggest may have been an early encounter with a perspective-consuming artifact, given that the village in question did experience an unusually low birth rate for decades afterward. Though skeptics point out that this could also be explained by economic hardship, disease, or simply the reasonable decision not to raise children in a community that enthusiastically burned people for having unusual opinions about household objects. You step back from the glass dome, feeling a slight vertigo that might be your imagination, or might be the mirror still reaching for possibilities even through its containment field. And your guide nods sympathetically before leading you toward the next exhibit, mentioning over his shoulder that nobody is allowed to stand near the mirror of perspective consumption for more than 4 minutes at a time because extended exposure tends to result in something he calls existential weight loss, which is exactly as ominous as it sounds. The next chamber opens before you like a throat preparing to speak, and the transition from the mirror's cold silver light to this room's warm golden glow feels almost medicinal, as though the architects understood that people moving through this vault would need occasional reminders that beauty can exist without malevolence. Though you suspect this respite is temporary because your guide's shoulders have tensed in the particular way of someone approaching a display they respect and fear in roughly equal measure. The centerpiece of this room is a sword, and your first instinct is relief because surely a sword is comprehensible in a way that reality-eating mirrors and direction-splitting compasses are not. But then you notice that the sword is suspended in absolute silence, that the ambient sounds of the vault, the distant drip of water, the hum of containment spells, the soft rhythm of your own breathing, all stop completely within 3 feet of the blade, and you understand immediately that this weapon's danger has nothing to do with its edge. Your guide speaks about the singing blade of unmaking in the hushed tones of someone describing a sleeping predator, explaining that the sword was forged in the 9th century by a Norse craftsman whose name has been deliberately expunged from every historical record because speaking it aloud allegedly summons an echo of his attention. And honestly, the fact that a 1,000-year-old dead blacksmith can still eavesdrop on conversations mentioning him suggests his craftsmanship extended beyond metalworking into extremely persistent forms of immortality. The blade produces a sound when wielded, your guide continues, a single sustained note that resonates at a frequency capable of dissolving the bonds between matter and meaning, which is a very technical way of saying that the sword literally unmakes things by singing them out of existence. And you think about all the times you've complained about neighbors playing loud music and feel suddenly grateful that their speakers were not forged by Vikings with unclear motivations? Much like the historical development of steel-making techniques that spread along the Silk Road and revolutionized warfare across 3 continents, the singing blade represents a fusion of metallurgical skill and magical innovation that has never been replicated. Though, unlike those beneficial technological transfers, nobody is particularly eager to share the methodology for creating weapons that can hum reality apart. The historical mainstream records numerous legendary swords with supernatural properties: Excalibur, Durandal, the 7-branch sword of Japanese regalia. But scholars remain divided on whether these legendary weapons possessed genuine magical properties or simply accumulated mythological significance through centuries of storytelling. A debate that becomes somewhat academic when you're standing 3 feet from a sword that definitely, verifiably, demonstrably dissolves things by making music at them. The blade's silence and containment is not natural, your guide explains, with something approaching admiration, but is instead maintained by a series of counter-harmonic wards that generate the precise opposite frequencies of the sword's potential sounds, creating a pocket of anti-noise that keeps the weapon dormant, the way lullabies keep children dormant, except in this case the child could casually eliminate a city block if it woke up cranky. You ask about the sword's history of use, immediately regretting the question when your guide's expression shifts from professional detachment to something closer to mourning, and he describes how the blade was wielded exactly 7 times between its creation and its containment, each use erasing not just the intended target, but also the context around it, leaving survivors with memories of people and places that no longer existed and no longer had ever existed, which is the kind of temporal grief that therapy was simply not designed to address. One particularly disturbing incident occurred in 1342, when a desperate warlord attempted to use the blade against an invading army, and succeeded in unmake the army so completely that the war they had been fighting also ceased to exist, leaving both nations confused about why they had mobilized in the first place, which you suppose counts as a peaceful resolution if you're willing to overlook the profound violation of causality required to achieve it. The fringe historical record contains references to singing weapons across multiple cultures, including a peculiar Irish legend about a harp whose music could kill, maim, or induce sleep depending on the tune. And while most historians dismiss such accounts as poetic metaphor, the existence of the blade before you suggests that perhaps the ancients were being disturbingly literal about their musical instruments' capabilities. Your guide mentions that the containment ward surrounding the sword must be renewed every 12 hours by a team of specialists who work in complete silence, communicating only through gestures because any sound produced near the blade risks being absorbed and transformed into something the ward cannot counter. And apparently there was an incident in 1923 when a maintenance worker sneezed, and the resulting harmonic disruption took 17 years to fully repair, which really puts your seasonal allergies into perspective. The sword's origin story, as much as can be reconstructed from fragmented sources and secondhand accounts, suggests that its creator forged it to end a conflict that consumed his family, his village, and eventually his own capacity for restraint, and that he sang his hatred and grief into the cooling metal for 9 days and 9 nights until the blade began singing back, which is either the most metal origin story you've ever heard or the most tragic, and you suspect it might be both. You step around the silent zone carefully, giving the blade more clearance than strictly necessary, and your guide nods approvingly at your caution before leading you toward the next chamber, mentioning that the vault's designers positioned the singing blade as far as possible from any other sound-sensitive artifacts, because apparently even in containment, dangerous magical objects can develop disagreements that nobody wants to witness. The corridor connecting the blade's chamber to the next exhibit stretches longer than the vault's external dimensions should allow, a detail your guide addresses before you can ask, by explaining that the Ministry employs space-folding enchantments throughout Level 13 to accommodate a collection that grows faster than the physical building can expand, which is both an elegant solution and a reminder that you are currently walking through geometry that would give Euclid a migraine. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. You emerge into a circular room dominated by a pedestal of black marble, upon which rests an hourglass so beautiful that your breath catches, despite everything you've learned about the relationship between beauty and danger in this place. Its twin chambers crafted from glass that seems to hold starlight and sand that moves upward as often as it falls down, completely indifferent to gravity's opinion on how particles should behave. The Hourglass of Infinite Regret earns its name not through melodrama, your guide explains, but through uncomfortable precision. It allows users to revisit any moment in their past, not to change it, not to intervene, but simply to experience it again with full awareness of everything that came after, a power that sounds almost gentle until you consider how devastating it would be to relive your happiest moments, knowing they will end, knowing exactly how they will end, knowing every mistake you will make afterward. Much like the historical practice of confession in medieval Catholicism, which required believers to revisit and articulate their sins as a pathway to absolution, the Hourglass offers a kind of spiritual archaeology that many users mistake for healing, until they discover that revisiting the past without the power to change it often amplifies guilt rather than resolving it, leaving them trapped in loops of regret that become progressively harder to escape. The Hourglass was created, according to the most reliable accounts, in 16th century Prague by a clockmaker who served in the court of Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor famous for his patronage of alchemists, astronomers, and occultists, and who reportedly commissioned the device after the death of his favorite mistress, so that he could spend time with her ghost in his memories, which is either terribly romantic or terribly unhealthy, depending on how generous you're feeling toward historical monarchs with poor coping mechanisms. Your guide approaches the pedestal with visible hesitation, explaining that the Hourglass emanates a low-level compulsion that makes nearby individuals suddenly eager to revisit moments they'd rather forget, and that new vault workers sometimes require debriefing after their first encounters with the device, not because it harmed them, but because standing near it for too long tends to surface things people have spent years burying, which seems like a passive-aggressive form of therapy that nobody asked for. The scholarly debate surrounding time revisitation artifacts centers on whether these objects genuinely access past moments or simply construct extremely convincing simulations from the user's memories. A distinction that might seem academic but carries profound implications for questions of consciousness, identity, and whether the version of you that existed 10 years ago still exists in some meaningful sense, or has been replaced so thoroughly that visiting them would be no different from watching a very accurate home movie. The mainstream historical record documents numerous attempts to build time manipulation devices, from the mechanical escapements of early clocks to the theoretical time dilation effects predicted by Einstein's relativity. And while magic and physics rarely agree on methodology, both traditions acknowledge that time is far more flexible than everyday experience suggests, which is comforting until you remember that flexibility in the wrong hands usually translates to catastrophe. The hourglass's most disturbing feature, your guide continues in his perpetual whisper, is that it accumulates regret from everyone who uses it, storing emotional residue in the sand itself, which now contains centuries of concentrated sorrow from wizards who couldn't stop revisiting the moments they wished they'd handled differently. And apparently the containment team once dropped the hourglass during transport, and the resulting wave of ambient grief made an entire wing of the ministry melancholy for 3 months, which must have made interdepartmental meetings even more unpleasant than usual. You watch the sand move in its defiant patterns, sometimes up, sometimes down, sometimes pausing mid-flow as though reconsidering its options. And you think about all the moments you might revisit if given the chance. The conversations you'd listen to more carefully, the silences you'd fill differently, the doors you walked through without looking back, and you understand suddenly why the ministry keeps this object locked away. Not because it causes immediate harm, but because it offers a temptation that almost nobody can resist, and almost everybody regrets resisting too late. There's a fringe historical footnote involving a Spanish monk from the 17th century who claimed to possess a similar device, which he used to revisit his childhood daily until he reportedly forgot how to exist in the present, spending his final years convinced that he was 8 years old despite his aging body's vigorous disagreement. And while the story is probably apocryphal, it captures something true about the danger of living backward that the hourglass makes terrifyingly possible. The craftsmanship of the object genuinely impresses you. The way light plays through the glass chambers, creating rainbows that seem almost apologetic about the suffering they contain. And your guide mentions that several art historians have requested permission to study the hourglass purely for its aesthetic qualities. Requests that are invariably denied because apparently wanting to understand beauty is not a compelling enough reason to risk existential despair, which seems reasonable on paper but probably disappoints the art historians tremendously. You force yourself to look away from the sand, breaking whatever subtle hold the hourglass was beginning to establish over your attention, and your guide's approving nod confirms that you made the right choice, though you suspect you'll spend years wondering about the moments you might have revisited, which perhaps proves the hourglass's power extends beyond its containment field through nothing more complicated than memory. The transition to the next chamber requires passing through a corridor lined with warning inscriptions in 17 languages, including 3 that your guide admits have been dead so long, their warnings can no longer be accurately translated, which seems like a design flaw until he explains that the inscription's emotional content remains effective regardless of linguistic comprehension, and indeed, you feel increasingly uneasy as you walk, despite understanding only a third of what the walls are saying. The chamber ahead houses what the ministry classifies as psychological armaments, which is apparently bureaucratic terminology for objects that attack the mind rather than the body, a category distinction that probably matters to the filing system, but feels somewhat academic when you're looking at artifacts capable of driving entire populations insane. The crown sits on a velvet pillow at the room's center, looking exactly like what you'd expect from royal regalia. Gold, jeweled, elegant, proportioned perfectly for a human head, and yet everyone who has worn it has descended into madness so complete that historical records simply describe them as lost, which is perhaps the most diplomatic euphemism for became a danger to themselves and every nation they governed. Your guide identifies it as the crown of whispered dominion, created, or perhaps discovered, since its origins remain an open scholarly debate, In the late Byzantine Empire, during a period of political instability so intense that succession disputes sometimes resolved themselves through supernatural means because conventional assassination apparently lacked flair. Much like the historical phenomenon of king's touch, the medieval belief that monarchs possessed divine healing powers that could cure diseases like scrofula, the crown promises its wearers access to supernatural authority, but instead of healing it, delivers a connection to something that speaks constantly, that advises without invitation, that gradually erases the wearer's own thoughts and replaces them with imperatives from sources that historical records consistently decline to name. The mainstream historical record confirms that Byzantine emperors often employed mystical consultants, from Christian holy men to pagan oracles, seeking divine guidance for their decisions. And while most of this spiritual counsel proved harmless, or at least neutral, certain artifacts from this period carry reputations for delivering advice that served unclear agendas, as though the objects themselves pursued goals that had nothing to do with imperial success or human flourishing. The crown was last worn in 1651 by a minor European duchess, whose name has been deliberately obscured from historical records. A kindness, your guide explains, to her descendants, who understandably prefer not to be associated with an ancestor who spent her final years convinced that furniture was conspiring against her, and that her own reflection had been replaced by something wearing her face incorrectly. You examine the crown from a safe distance, noting how the gold seems slightly too bright, the jewels slightly too clear, the proportions slightly too perfect, as though the object is trying very hard to look like ordinary regalia, and slightly overperforming, which is honestly more unsettling than obvious malevolence, because it suggests the crown understands presentation and audience in ways inanimate objects should not. The whispers the crown delivers, your guide explains, are not auditory but conceptual. Wearers don't hear voices so much as find themselves suddenly knowing things they have no reason to know, receiving certainties about people and situations that feel indistinguishable from their own conclusions. And the insidiousness lies precisely in this seamlessness. Because how do you resist thoughts that feel entirely like your own? There's a fringe historical account from a Russian monastery claiming that the crown was originally created as a devotional aid, designed to let saints commune directly with divine wisdom, but that something went wrong during its consecration, either through error or sabotage, leaving the artifact connected to sources decidedly less celestial, though skeptics point out that demonic corruption of holy objects was a convenient explanation for basically anything that didn't work as intended during the medieval period. The ministry acquired the crown in 1847, the same year as the mirror of prospective consumption, your guide notes, as that was apparently a very productive year for the confiscation team. From an auction house that had no idea what they were selling and simply thought it was pretty, which it absolutely is, in the way that certain poisonous insects are pretty, which is to say in a way that should really serve as a warning rather than an invitation. The containment protocols for the crown involve layers of lead, silver, and cold iron, metals with traditional associations to protection against supernatural influence, though your guide admits that nobody is entirely certain which layer is actually doing the work, and the ministry maintains all three out of abundance of caution, which seems like the only reasonable approach when dealing with ancient headwear that definitely wants to be worn and definitely should not be. You watch the crown for a moment longer, wondering if the slight sensation of pressure at your temples is your imagination or something more deliberate, and you're relieved when your guide steers you toward the chamber exit, mentioning that prolonged observation sometimes creates sympathetic resonance with the artifact's whispers. And, frankly, you prefer your thoughts to remain entirely your own. Thank you very much, even if that means missing out on omniscient insights from questionable sources. The final detail your guide offers about the crown is perhaps the most disturbing. 3 of the 7 monarchs who wore it are described in historical records as having experienced periods of unusual competence before their descent into madness, making decisions that benefited their kingdoms in ways that seemed almost prescient, which suggests that whatever speaks through the crown occasionally offers genuine wisdom mixed with the poison. And nothing is more dangerous than a curse that works perfectly some of the time. You leave the crown of whispered dominion behind with genuine relief, though the corridor ahead somehow feels narrower than before, as though the vault itself is testing your commitment to continuing this tour. and you wonder briefly if claustrophobia is an appropriate response to architecture, or whether the walls here simply understand that they're guarding things people would rather not find. The next chamber opens into a space so vast it contradicts everything you know about underground construction. Its ceiling lost in shadows that even the eternal flames mounted on the walls cannot penetrate. And you realize with growing unease that this room was designed not for display but for restraint, because the artifacts here are too large and too dangerous to keep in cases. The chains hang from iron fixtures older than the ministry itself, each link forged from metal that gleams with a light having nothing to do with the flames. And your guide's voice drops to its lowest register as he explains that these are the chains of eternal binding, created to imprison entities that could not be destroyed, and could not be killed, and could not be reasoned with, a category of supernatural threat that the ministry officially denies exists, while simultaneously maintaining an entire department dedicated to managing it. Much like the historical tradition of binding spirits through ritual and inscription, practiced across cultures from Mesopotamian demon bowls to European grimoire traditions, the chains represent an attempt to contain forces beyond human control through sheer magical engineering. And while mainstream historians generally dismiss spirit binding as superstition, the artifacts before you suggest that someone, at some point, was binding something, and doing so with resources that indicate serious institutional commitment. The chains currently hang empty, which your guide describes as technically good news, though his hesitation suggests the story is more complicated. And indeed, he explains that the chains have been used exactly 4 times in recorded history, each time to contain an entity whose description remains classified at levels above his clearance, and that 3 of those containments remain active somewhere in the vault's deeper levels, which implies that the ministry's underground extension goes considerably further down than the tour will take you. The scholarly debate surrounding entities of binding centers on whether these creatures represent genuine supernatural beings independent of human existence, or whether they are somehow produced by human consciousness, manifestations of collective fear or belief given form through magical resonance. And while the distinction might seem philosophical, it carries practical implications because entities that emerge from humanity might theoretically be reabsorbed by humanity, while entities that exist independently presumably existed before humans and will presumably continue existing afterward, which is not a comforting thought when you're standing near chains designed to hold things too powerful to die. The mainstream historical record contains surprisingly abundant references to immortal beings requiring physical restraint rather than destruction. Prometheus chained to his rock, Loki bound beneath the serpent, the various titans imprisoned in Tartarus. And while these stories are typically interpreted as mythology, the chains before you suggest that perhaps the ancients were documenting procedures rather than inventing poetry, a possibility that reframes thousands of years of narrative tradition as classified incident reports. Your guide approaches one set of chains with visible reluctance, explaining that these particular links were last used in 1789, during a period of social upheaval so intense that something apparently took notice and attempted to manifest through the collective emotional energy, which is either the most disturbing explanation for the French Revolution you've ever heard, or a spectacular coincidence that nobody in the ministry believes is actually coincidental. The metal of the chains feels cold even from several feet away, radiating a chill that bypasses your skin and settles directly into your bones. And your guide mentions that this is a feature rather than a side effect, as the cold represents the chain's active suppression of whatever heat or energy their prisoners might generate, and that the only time the chains grow warm is when something is trying to break free, at which point the temperature differential becomes a useful early warning system for the containment team. There exists a fringe historical account from a 16th century witch trial in which the accused described chains that bind what cannot be bound, holding the old ones beneath the new world. And while this was interpreted at the time as heretical rambling warranting execution, modern magical historians have noted that the description matches certain classified ministry documents with uncomfortable precision, suggesting that either the accused somehow accessed information she should not have known, or that the entities in question were maintaining their own public relations through selected human intermediaries, which honestly seems like a lot of effort for beings that are allegedly imprisoned. The chain's craftsmanship defies easy analysis, your guide continues, with metallurgical studies suggesting materials that should not exist in the combinations present, alloys that violate known chemistry and yet obviously function, which has led some researchers to propose that the chains were not made on Earth at all, a theory that the ministry neither confirms nor denies with a silence that speaks volumes. You ask who created the chains, and your guide's answer is perhaps the most honest thing he's said all tour. We don't know, we've never known. And frankly, the question keeps certain researchers awake at night, because if something made these chains specifically to bind these entities, then something knew these entities existed and knew they would need binding, which implies a level of cosmic planning that most people find profoundly uncomfortable. The empty chains sway slightly despite the absence of any breeze, a motion your guide attributes to resonance with their occupied counterparts somewhere in the vault's depths, and you understand suddenly why this room is so large. It needs space for the chains to move, needs distance between observers and artifacts, needs room for the kind of emergency evacuation that hopefully never becomes necessary, but that someone clearly planned for. You move toward the exit faster than you've moved in any previous chamber, and your guide matches your pace without comment, though you notice he glances back at the chains with something that might be professional concern, or might be genuine fear, and honestly, at this depth into the tour, the distinction seems increasingly academic.
The corridor leading to the 8th chamber slopes downward at an angle that makes your ears pop, and your guide mentions casually that you are now deeper underground than any civilian structure in London, deeper than the tube tunnels, deeper than the Victorian sewers, deeper than the Roman foundations that history forgot, though he adds with gentle sarcasm that at least the lighting remains consistent, which is apparently what passes for comfort in the ministry's vault design philosophy. The room ahead glows with the soft illumination of a reading lamp, a domesticity that feels almost obscene after the cosmic dread of the previous chambers. And at the room's center sits a lectern holding a book so ordinary in appearance that you almost laugh, though the laugh dies when you notice that the pages are turning themselves and that the book's leather cover bears no title, no author, no markings of any kind, except a worn impression where countless hands have gripped it despite clear instructions never to touch. The Book of Final Chapters has earned its euphemistic name through centuries of demonstrating exactly what happens when people ignore warnings and open its covers anyway. And your guide's explanation arrives in fragments, as though speaking too much about the book at once might attract its attention, which he assures you is not superstition, but standard protocol based on documented incidents. Much like the historical index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic Church's list of banned books maintained from the 16th century until 1966, the Book of Final Chapters was originally classified as forbidden reading. Though unlike the index, which banned books for containing heretical ideas, this book was banned for containing something considerably more personal, accurate, detailed descriptions of how its readers would die, written in the first person, in the reader's own handwriting, even if the reader had never held a pen in their life. The mainstream historical record includes numerous accounts of prophetic books, from the Sibylline oracles of ancient Rome to the apocalyptic visions of Nostradamus. And while scholars debate whether any of these texts contain genuine predictive content, the Book of Final Chapters bypasses such debates by generating its predictions fresh for each reader, personalizing prophecy in ways that mass-market apocalypticism never achieved. Your guide approaches the lectern with the careful movements of someone defusing an explosive, explaining that the book is currently open to its index page, which shows no text but which will begin filling with words if anyone looks at it for more than 7 seconds, and that the containment protocols require him to flip the page every 6 seconds precisely, a rhythm he maintains with the practiced automaticity of someone who has done this thousands of times and intends to continue. The book's creation is attributed, in sources that the ministry considers relatively reliable, to a 15th century monastic order that believed foreknowledge of death would help Christians prepare their souls for judgment. a theological argument that probably seemed reasonable until the order's members started finding extremely detailed descriptions of their own deaths appearing on pages they couldn't remember writing, at which point the project was declared a failure and the book was sealed in what the monks apparently believed was an adequately secure location, which it obviously was not. There exists a fringe historical account suggesting the book once belonged to a Venetian doge who read his entry daily for 13 years. Not from morbid fascination, but because the book kept revising his death date backward, buying him additional time each time the text changed, though skeptics point out that this story probably originated as an advertisement for the book's alleged benefits, rather than a genuine historical record, and besides, the doge in question still died, just later than originally scheduled. The scholarly debate surrounding the book centers on whether it actually predicts the future, or whether reading it somehow creates the deaths it describes, a distinction with profound implications because the first interpretation makes the book a neutral instrument of prophecy, while the second makes it an active agent of fate, and nobody can quite figure out how to test either theory without sacrificing additional readers to the experiment. The pages turning themselves makes a sound like breath, your guide notes, not mechanical motion, but something closer to respiration, and he admits that new containment staff sometimes report the book seeming to watch them, which is difficult to verify given that books do not have eyes, but which happens frequently enough that the ministry includes perceived observation in its standard incident reports. You ask, against your better judgment, what happens to people who read their entries, and your guide's answer takes the form of a list. Paranoia because they know how it ends, attempted prevention, which never works, resignation, which sometimes accelerates the timeline, and occasionally, rarely, a kind of peace, because certainty eliminates anxiety, even when the certainty is terrible. The book continues its rhythmic breathing as you observe it, pages lifting and settling with mechanical regularity that fails to disguise the organic quality underneath, and you think about all the endings you've imagined for yourself, the fears you've entertained, the deaths you've dismissed as unlikely, and you wonder which of them waits in a book that apparently knows you better than you know yourself. Your guide finally breaks the rhythm, closing the book with a decisive snap that echoes through the chamber, and he explains that it will remain shut for exactly 24 hours before resuming its autonomous page-turning, a built-in rest period that nobody understands, but everyone appreciates because even books about death apparently need their beauty sleep. The ninth chamber exists at a depth where your sense of direction has completely abandoned you, and you're fairly certain that the vault's geometry has become theoretical rather than physical, a suggestion of space rather than actual dimensions, though your guide assures you that the floors remain solid and the air remains breathable, which seem like minimal requirements for a tour, but which you appreciate nonetheless. The darkness here is different from the darkness of previous chambers, not merely an absence of light, but a presence of something that light refuses to touch. And at the room's center floats an orb perhaps 2 feet in diameter, its surface appearing to absorb every photon that reaches it while simultaneously emitting a kind of anti-glow that makes the space around it seem darker than darkness should be able to achieve. The orb of consuming shadows has been contained in this chamber for 347 years, your guide explains, and in that time it has grown by exactly 4 inches in diameter, a rate of expansion that the ministry calculates will become problematic in approximately 12,000 years, by which point they assume either magical technology will have solved the problem or humanity will have much bigger concerns. Much like the historical black holes first theorized by John Michel in 1783 and later developed by Einstein's general relativity, the orb represents a concentration of something so intense that nothing escapes its influence. Though unlike astronomical black holes, the orb consumes not just light but also memory, emotion, and the abstract quality that philosophers call qualia, which is a fancy way of saying it eats the experience of experience itself. The orb was created accidentally in the late 17th century by an alchemist attempting to distill pure darkness, a project that sounds like something a goth teenager might doodle in a notebook, but which apparently received serious funding from patrons interested in applications ranging from military stealth to existential philosophy, and the alchemist's notes, which the ministry recovered from his empty laboratory, described the moment of creation as like watching the sun set forever in a single heartbeat. Your guide maintains a distance from the orb that exceeds his caution near any previous artifact, explaining that proximity to the sphere triggers a progressive erosion of sensory experience, beginning with peripheral vision and ending with core identity, and that researchers who stayed too close for too long reported forgetting not just specific memories, but the capacity to remember, losing not just particular feelings, but the ability to feel at all. The mainstream historical record includes numerous references to shadow magic, from the Greek concept of the underworld as a realm of shades to various folkloric traditions about shadows as separate entities from the bodies that cast them. And while most scholars interpret these traditions metaphorically, the orb before you suggests that shadow as an independent phenomenon might deserve reconsideration, though admittedly that reconsideration would need to happen from a safe distance. The scholarly debate surrounding the orb concerns whether it truly consumes the things it absorbs, or whether it merely redistributes them to locations beyond current detection, a question that matters because the first interpretation makes the orb a genuine threat to existence, while the second suggests everything it takes might theoretically be recovered, and researchers have spent decades designing experiments to test these hypotheses without anyone actually having to get close enough to verify the results. The orb makes no sound, your guide notes, and this absence of sound is itself wrong, because absolute silence does not exist in nature, because air molecules vibrate and blood pulses and neurons fire with tiny audible signals, and the orb's silence represents the subtraction of all these sounds. Not quiet, but the removal of quiet's opposite, a void where noise should be. There exists a fringe historical account from a colonial-era explorer who claimed to have encountered a sphere of unmade night in a cave system in what is now the American Southwest, describing an object that drank the firelight from my torch and the warmth from my words. And while most historians dismiss this as creative writing influenced by exhaustion and probable dehydration, the description matches the orb's observed properties with uncomfortable precision, suggesting either a coincidence or a family of similar objects distributed across the world. Your guide mentions that the orb's containment is less about imprisonment and more about monitoring, since no material has proven capable of blocking its influence, and no magic has proven capable of reversing its growth, and that the ministry's strategy essentially amounts to keep watching it and hope someone invents a solution before the 12,000-year deadline arrives, which is perhaps the longest-term contingency planning you've ever encountered. The darkness around the orb pulses with rhythms that might be your imagination, or might be something more deliberate, and you find yourself avoiding looking directly at it, not because you're afraid of what you'll see, but because you're afraid of what you'll stop seeing, the colors fading from your peripheral vision, the details softening into gray, the world becoming less real, one photon at a time. You step backward without consciously deciding to move, and your guide nods approval while leading you toward the exit, mentioning that the final chamber awaits and that after everything you've witnessed, you've earned a gentler ending than most of this vault provides. The final chamber of the ministry's most classified vault feels less like a room and more like a sigh, its walls curved softly, its lighting warm and amber, its atmosphere carrying the faint scent of old wood and older books, as though the architects understood that anyone reaching this point would need decompression before returning to the surface world above. You settle into a chair that materialized without your noticing, its cushions conforming to your body with the particular comfort of furniture that has been sat in by centuries of exhausted visitors, and your guide takes a seat opposite you, his vigilance finally softening into something that might be genuine friendliness, or might simply be the permission to stop being professionally cautious. The tour ends here, he explains, not because there is nothing more to see, but because there is always more to see. And the ministry long ago learned that visitors who tried to absorb the entire collection in a single visit tended to leave with their sense of reality permanently loosened, which makes for interesting philosophy but terrible reintegration into normal society. The chamber houses no dangerous artifacts, only records, leather-bound journals documenting every object contained in the vault, their origins where known, their capabilities where tested, Their fates were sealed, and the names of everyone who contributed to keeping them locked away from the world that cannot know they exist. Much like the historical tradition of library catalogs dating back to the ancient library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, these records represent an attempt to impose order on chaos, to make the unmanageable manageable through the simple act of writing it down, and scholars continue debating whether documentation itself carries protective properties or whether the comfort of organization is merely psychological. Your guide offers you something warm to drink, appearing from nowhere in the way magical beverages often do, and you accept it gratefully as the warmth spreads through your tired hands and the gentle steam carries scents of honey and chamomile and something else you cannot name, but which makes your eyelids grow pleasantly heavy. The history of this vault extends backward beyond the ministry's founding, he explains quietly, with records suggesting that magical communities have been containing dangerous objects since the first wizards realized that some powers should not be used, that some knowledge should not be sought, that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. You feel the weight of everything you've witnessed beginning to settle into your memory, the compass pointing in 17 directions, the mirror-eating futures, the sword-singing silence, the hourglass moving against gravity, the crown whispering invitations, the chains swaying empty, the book breathing, the orb consuming, and all of it safely contained, carefully watched, patiently guarded by people who understand that some things must be remembered precisely because they cannot be forgotten. There exists, your guide mentions with a small smile, a fringe historical suggestion that the vault itself is sentient, that it observes its contents and its visitors with an awareness that transcends architecture, that it has opinions about who enters and what they deserve to see, though the mainstream ministry position remains that this is simply the accumulated effect of centuries of magic seeping into stone. The fire in the chamber crackles softly, and you realize that the shadows here are gentle, ordinary, cast by flames rather than consumed by spheres, and that the silence is comfortable rather than absolute, filled with the small sounds of settling embers and distant water and your own steady breathing. Your guide's voice grows quieter still, explaining that visitors sometimes fall asleep in this chamber, that the vault permits this, even encourages it, because dreams had in this place tend toward peace rather than nightmares, as though all the darkness contained in the levels above has exhausted the building's capacity for fear and left only a profound, protective quiet. The warmth of the drink spreads through your chest, your shoulders, your tired eyes, and the chair seems to embrace you more completely. And you understand that the tour is ending, not with revelation, but with rest, not with danger, but with the assurance that danger exists precisely because people have chosen to contain it. Your breathing slows, matches the rhythm of the distant flames, and the last thing you hear before sleep claims you is your guide's voice, gentle as starlight, assuring you that the vault will watch over you tonight, just as it watches over everything else, and that you will wake to a world made safer by secrets kept carefully in the dark.